Okay, so I'm going to return more to some issues that labor has to deal with. And again, I want to remind you that, and I'll keep saying this as we go over this period, that every kind of, the discussion about sweatshops and the conditions that people experience overseas was the same condition that Americans were experiencing at this time period. Some elements of the working class, or many, enough so that that we're donating so much time to this discussion. I want you to kind of just realize that the discussion of labor's relation to capital was huge, and this dilemma of the advancement of capitalism and what that would mean for workers are this entity of the so-called middle class, right? And again, as you pay attention to this discussion that takes place in these next few chapters, these are, I will remind you, so pivotal to the elements of all of the discussions that even take place now in regards to income inequality in America and the different approaches people take to it. So, having said that, going back to the impact of technology, I think it's clear to see that we've already kind of discussed that aspect. Why were industrial workplaces so dangerous? It's very simple. Now we know that there are regulations for the conditions in which workers are subjected to. That was not the case until there would be legislation to come later to deal with this. And actually, this is the kind of thing that I want you to really appreciate, and that I hope that I don't say so much to bore you, but at the same time enough for you to remember. Almost all the rights that you enjoy as a worker now, you take for granted. That you don't work in an environment where you're exposed to potentially the chance of dying or losing a limb, and that there are legitimate precautions made to make sure that your safety is intact. Well, it was these struggles of these workers' movements that we're covering in this section, and then legislation that was passed by politicians after basically riots, demonstrations, strikes, and a decision to make of, do we let the capitalists at the time have complete free range on whatever is good, what they think is good for their economic interests, or what about the people that are simply working, that are not big time investors? Okay, so in this case we have a young boy who was a worker, lost a limb. We will see in the next week or two, I will be having us watch a documentary and talking about a woman named Mother Jones, who went out of her way to abolish child labor in the United States and saw this as a terrible atrocity to happen in our country. And yes, it was widespread. And yes, children were losing their limbs. And yes, these things still take place in other countries. So I'm always reminding my students, I'm not saying that everybody who owns big businesses wants to do these things. I'm totally not saying that. But what I am saying is, we have to realize that it's only because of our regulations that were forced on large businesses to stop this practice, that they stopped. And then those practices have remained in other nations where laws have not been passed. So you can't take for granted that those things won't happen again here. In other words, labor rights. We're talking about freedom. Americans always think about our freedom. We celebrate our freedom and liberty. But there were certain freedoms and liberties that we don't actually associate with the labor movement. Okay? So we associate freedom and liberty with soldiers protecting our freedom and liberty. I'm not demoting that at all. But what I'm saying is that the labor movement also has secured our liberty and our right for our children not to go through this kind of thing. My daughter works as a 17-year-old, and I feel in relatively safe conditions. Thank goodness for that being a real thing, and that it's only a few hours a week and that she can focus on her school, right? This was not something that we could take for granted in the past. Again, I just want to remind you of that. So this is that Mother Jones documentary, which I'll have you watch later. So now, why were employers so hostile to labor unions? Why are they still? Well, I mean, right now what's been happening is a major crackdown on unions in the United States. Right now, currently. And, you know, I'm sure that the students that are listening to this will have a wide range of opinions. I think I've already mentioned to you that I've seen in my family different types of economic circumstances and positions have led them to have different opinions about unions. And right now, you know, some people talk about abuse of unions. Sometimes laborers get frustrated that a union will endorse a president, and not all the workers in that union actually want that to be what their union endorses. There's a lot of those kind of issues. Ultimately, though, I think that we just shouldn't forget that there's always been a hostility towards labor unions. You can decide for yourself if you think that labor unions made America better from this time period or not. It's kind of hard not to make a statement on that, because legislation does prove in this chapter that an 8-hour workday, okay, not having a 14-hour workday is because of unions. Now, I think that that's a better thing, okay? You know, that the labor movement provided that. But again, you know, there's a lot of different types of circumstances that happen with these situations. Now, the next question on the PowerPoint is, why were industrial workers so divided? You know, sometimes workers really just have an ingrained respect for their boss. It doesn't really just talk about that, but, you know, not liking to, you know, would rather just kind of be complicit and obedient. But one of the bigger issues also was divisions of gender and racism. And, you know, I always quote this. I quoted this in terms of what Native Americans experience here. The Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, when he says, if your enemy is united, divide him. I always remind this to my students, because I think that that's one of the most fundamental tactics of anybody who sees potential enemies in their camp, right? I mean, there's strength in numbers. And the idea, I mean, for Karl Marx in a Communist Manifesto, they say workers of the world unite. What's one thing that can always divide a worker? Good old-fashioned racism. And in fact, many times this was exploited, this understanding by employers, okay? And we even had actual spies within camps. If you remember in the Carnegie video, you saw that Carnegie was one of the first to really pioneer the idea of using worker spies to blacklist anybody who would want to create unions or, you know, do something to complain about the conditions of the workers. Keep in mind, in places like Latin America to this day, in Colombia and so forth, and many other parts of the world, and still sometimes in some, you know, rare instances now, but that one I should take back a little bit. I don't know of a specific case, but I know, like, for a fact, in Latin America, places like Nigeria, other places, people trying to create unions are still intimidated and sometimes even killed, often suspiciously by the company that does not want the workers to organize. So it's a very seriously deadly set of circumstances that we, again, take for granted as something that wouldn't be normal in the United States, okay? And so we saw in the textbook, you know, even magazines and journalists and other people who were not necessarily pro-union saw that the conditions that people living like this, you know, a girl working in these grueling conditions all day with this harsh overseer, and then coming home to simply this, you know, shack with rats and can barely eat. This is just not, you know, you can't call yourself the land of the free, so one argument went, and have these kind of conditions, right? And in the middle of all these conditions, we led to a lot of conflict. And again, there was, in the middle of this, as workers were struggling, the issues of foreigners and racism escalated. And isn't that what's happening also right now? At this time, it was the Chinese, and there was this attempts to cut back Chinese. They were seen as people would take all of our jobs. You could argue now that the position of the Chinese and the stereotype by certain elements within the country is replaced now by the Mexican. And I regret to say that, but I think we can see that when we have presidential leaders, people running for office and so forth, who use that kind of rhetoric now very overtly, regardless of what you think of that, that is a thing that we have to just be honest about. That kind of a targeting of a particular ethnic group, as seen as a kind of downgrading the quality of life for the regular white worker, is still a thing. Okay, it just is. So, all right, now with the legacy of unions giving so much to workers' rights through these struggles over time, it was never clear to everybody, even workers, if unions were good, and it's still not now, as I said. And so here's some discussions of them. We talk about trade unions were often seen as despotic towards members, oppressive, meddling, taking too much control, basically forcing you as a worker to join some collective that you have to be listened to. The other side said that these are actually necessary for workers' protection, that you would never get a safe working environment with fair wages without the ability to strike and show your employer that they need the workers as much as the workers need the employer, that it's a two-way street. Yes, no one would have a job without the employer, but the employer, they would say, can't get anything done without the workers, right? And so when you go on strike, you're sending a message that, hey, these machines don't run by themselves. Don't just act like because you've invested in all this property and took all this risk that those of us who are doing this aren't worth something, right? Okay, so that's one other element to this argument. We saw the issues with women also coming in and playing a stronger role, fulfilling the role of nurses. I feel like, let's see, I wanted to cover a lot here, and forgive me, I hate skipping over like, oh yeah, there was women, anyways, we're moving on. No, let's not do that. So I just wanted to point out that okay, I accidentally hit pause, and so I'm not sure, I kind of made this garbled. So what led to the condition of more women starting to work? Well, first of all, with the creation of factories, many families couldn't survive without women working, and this led to more women working. Of course, one of the issues that women have always drawn attention to when it comes to the issue of labor rights is that while they would often be put in the workforce working 14-hour days, 12-hour days, the same as men, the roles of women were expected to still remain the same on the domestic front. So if there's kids, household cleaning, and all these other kind of things, then would still be left on the women. And so you had those kind of issues. And then ultimately, as the unions were organizing, this kind of gender discrimination that men still felt superior to women, just as there was the issue of race, would be a play in which unions would have to kind of come to terms with, were they going to be inclusive or exclusive? And what I wanted to get into and cover the Knights of Labor, and do a discussion of social Darwinism. Let's see here. All right, I'm going to end this section right here, and then I'm going to return to these other ones, the next section.